Good afternoon. Welcome to Asbestos Awareness and Lead-Based Paint, Renovation, Repair, and Painting Rule, the second in a series of webinars for the Clean, Green, and Healthy Tribal Schools Initiative that are scheduled each Wednesday through February 22nd at this same time. Several of the programs are double features, such as the two you will enjoy today. You're joining 86 other guests from communities, tribes, federal and state government agencies, schools, universities, and Head Start programs. Thank you for your interest in the health of our schools and communities. There are 4 ways that you will be invited to participate in this and other webinars in the series. Following the presentation, we will invite your questions. You may present a question or a comment in either of 2 ways. One is to raise your hand. Simply click on the symbol of the hand in the control panel that you see on the right side of your screen. During the question and answer session, I'll open your microphone at that time so that you can ask the question on the air. Other participants will hear your question and the presenter's answer. You may also submit a question by typing it in the question box in the lower part of the panel. I will forward that question on to the presenter. You will remain anonymous unless you ask me to include your name when I send on the question. We want to know what you know and what you learned from participating in the webinar, so we've also included 2 polls in which you'll be invited to participate. When you leave the session, you'll also be asked to participate in a multiple choice survey question. That should take 40 seconds or less to complete. In addition to today's 2 programs, 8 more webinar topics will be covered in the next 5 Wednesdays, including integrated pest management and green cleaning, which are scheduled for next Wednesday, February 1st. Please join us for any or all of these programs. Links for registration are, and you can see the address at the top of the screen, http://epa.gov, Region 8, Tribal Schools. 9 diverse professionals, known experts in their fields, have looked forward to providing this and the other 4 webinar week sessions. In the event that you were unable to attend the first webinar on school chemical cleanout and PCBs in schools, presented by Matthew Langenfeld, all the webinars will become available on that same address, www.epa.gov, Region 8/Tribal Schools. I'd like to introduce the people behind the scenes of the Clean, Green, and Healthy Tribal Schools Initiative. At the top left is the contract manager, Matthew Langenfeld. Matthew is the Chemical Initiative Coordinator for the Pollution Prevention and Toxics Unit of the Environmental Protection Agency in Region 8. Sean Lopez, President and owner of Orion Environmental, is the project manager. Orion Environmental provides environmental site assessments, abatement, removal, and inspection for schools and other buildings, and contracting and training. Finally, I am Dr. Carolina Smiley Marcus, the project coordinator and your facilitator for the webinars. I provide neutral and educational professional services, including government-to-government and environmental issues. Our presenter today is Chris Maksimuk. Chris has been an asbestos and lead paint compliance inspector for the EPA for 4 years and has performed hundreds of asbestos and lead-based paint inspections in Region 8. Chris is a retired police officer from the LAPD, and with his background in building sciences, he's provided asbestos awareness classes to tribal schools, and as a residential and commercial inspector, he has provided forensic evaluations of building component failures. Before Chris gives you the answers, will you respond to 2 questions by selecting and clicking on the answer that you prefer? After everyone has indicated your choices, I will share the results with you. So begin with this one. Asbestos is dangerous and can cause asbestosis even when it has not been disturbed. Please answer. I see the answers are coming in quickly. We've got 51% have voted. Continue. Yes. It's still climbing. 77% have voted. Thank you. It's slowing down. So we'll give you another few seconds. 85% have voted. You have a few seconds more if you haven't had a chance to vote. All right, I'm going to close the poll, give you an opportunity to see the answer. All right, Chris, it looks like that you've got a split in opinions here. Some people say true, some people say false. So we're going to hide those results, and I have another question for you. Which of the following asbestos containing building materials is most dangerous? So if you go ahead and start your voting. Okay, votes are coming in really quickly. It looks like some split decisions, Chris. 71% have voted. So we've gotten about to the 85% again. And I'll give you a few more seconds to vote if you haven't. 90% are coming in this time, Chris. So, all right, we'll close the poll, share the results with you, and you can see that there are different opinions. All right, I'm going to hide the results. Thank you. Chris will be describing situations involving asbestos and related dangers to health. Chris?
Thank you, Carolina. I'd like to start with just the objectives that I'm going to be trying to teach across today. And one of the things that I want to do is make sure I go over the answers to the questions as we approach the topics. But today, right now, we're going to be defining asbestos. We're going to explain how to work safe with asbestos, identifying the safety risks, and materials that may contain asbestos. We're going to recognize the hazardous situations and the regulations and how it applies to asbestos in your school. All righty. Okay. What we're going to talk about asbestos, the actual product. It's the mineral. It's a metamorphic rock, and it's a naturally occurring mineral that was added to building materials, and because of its great strength, its soundproofing, fireproofing, corrosion resistance, and one other thing that's not listed in here, it's its chemical resistance. It's one tough mineral, and it's a metamorphic rock. It was a rock many, many millions of years ago, and due to the pressures of the earth, the chemicals in the earth, its physical changes, this rock is created called asbestos. It's mined in open pit minings, which means surface mining. They don't dig down, 300 feet or 600 feet to get it. It's right at the surface or below the surface. There are still mines across the United States that are abandoned that contain asbestos at the surface or near the surface. Its great usage really spiked in World War II. Right now we're going to look at a quick video. It's 2 minutes, and it's from the BC, stands for British Columbia, and it's the Work Safe video that is just wonderful. So stand by, and we'll take a look at that. Asbestosis is one of the biggest diseases out there that is caused by asbestos, and it's not a cancer. Asbestos fibers that are being inhaled in the lungs. They stay there for a long, long time, and the fibers cause cells and cause tissues to die and try to regenerate, but they cannot. The elasticity of the lungs stops functioning. It's a pretty awful death, and it's basically suffocating.
The fibers lodge in the delicate lung tissue where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells try and break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more fibers embed in the lungs. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working. Since the year 2000, more workers have died from asbestos disease in BC than any other workplace injury. For information on how to protect yourself from asbestos exposure, visit WorksafeBC.com.
We're going to talk about the health effects here, the screen in front of you. And if you see these little fibers here, what I want to explain is that asbestos is such a fine mineral. And what you see here is thousands of fibers. A single fiber of asbestos, it's not visible to the eye. They are approximately 1/10,000th, as small as 1/10,000th the size of a human hair. So because they are so small, these fibers and light, they can remain in the air for days or even a week. And it just circulates on air current around the house when it's disturbed. When somebody disturbs the ceiling or piping that might have asbestos, these fibers stay in the air until they either settle or they go into the outside air as the window's open, or we inhale them. And our lungs are the best filter for that because these fibers get stuck in the lungs, and that's where they stay. So do not disturb anything that may be asbestos. And we'll talk about some of the materials that may contain asbestos, but right now we're talking about the health effects. And one of the questions we had, was asbestos hazardous even though it's not disturbed? And the answer is it is not hazardous. The problem comes when the ball board is cut out that may contain asbestos, the piping. That's when asbestos gets airborne and poses the health effects. And the three main health effects that asbestos causes, and I'm trying to advance the slide here, is one, asbestosis, and that is not a cancer. Then there's lung cancer and mesothelioma, which is the last one. Now, I'm going to talk about these types of cancers and non-cancers, the first one being asbestosis, and that's what that little short video was supposed to show. It's not a cancer. It reduces the lung capacity, and it can be fatal indirectly from the hearts and lungs. It takes 15 to 30 years for it to come into effect. And usually the complaints, usually people have lung or chest pain, and the doctor takes the x-rays and discovers, as you can see in here, they have lung issues, serious lung issues. Okay, now there's the lung cancer, and that is definitely a cancer. And its prognosis, it's a slow and painful death. It takes a long time for it to usually occur. 15, 30 years later, probably when we're ready to retire or close to retirement age, and then unfortunately a diagnosis comes in as cancer. If you smoke, there's a very high increased risk of getting lung cancer or asbestosis from asbestos. The last one you might be familiar with, it's called mesothelioma. And it's I believe about 4,000 people in the United States die of this very, very painful death. It's a rare lung cancer. The symptoms are shortness of breath, chest pain, and the prognosis is generally quick. People usually don't live too long after it. I believe they average about 1 year after. And it's a cancer that gets between the chest wall and the lung. These fibers make their way, and doctors are not sure exactly how they make their way to that chest wall, that sheathing that's around the lungs, how it makes its way to that location. But when it does, people do not have long to live after. And we're going to be talking about ACBM, which is asbestos-containing building materials. Asbestos-containing building materials, it's considered asbestos-containing when it contains 1%. That's not very much. If you think about insulation, a handful of insulation that may contain asbestos, in your mind, or in this picture here, you see this hand here carrying this, holding this crumbly kind of material. Only 1% of that has to have asbestos in it for it to be considered this hazard. So that's how concerned we are, the EPA is, with eliminating asbestos exposure. Now there's two types. There's one that's friable, and that basically means if you can crumble it by hand. An example of that would be, the popcorn ceiling or some other fiber that you can crush by hand. That poses the most hazardous. And then there's non-friable, and that is floor tile, and it's in good condition. We talked about what it means to be friable, or one of the things, if it has a potential to be friable, such as if you cut it, saw it, sand it, and then it becomes airborne, friable, and poses a hazard. Okay, we're going to be talking about TSI, or thermal system insulation, surfacing materials, and miscellaneous materials. These are in your schools. These are in your homes possibly. I shouldn't say they're not in every school, but schools, we will talk about that in a minute, have a program to make sure that they know if they have asbestos or not. But thermal insulation is on pipes, boilers, ducts, elbows, and the mudded joints. If you ever go into a boiler room, you might see that. And it's subject to damage unless protected. When I go to schools and do the AHERA education program, I let the maintenance custodians know, don't hang mops, brooms, and don't damage it, don't climb on it. And here's some pictures of thermal insulation, TSI, around pipes that is coming apart. And you can see this falls to the floor and gets tracked. And here's some picture of air insulation, a cross-section of it. This aero insulation here is like a cardboard. And this cardboard here is impregnated with asbestos to give it that tremendous strength. It retains heat, and it also poses a health threat in these conditions. As you can see, it's falling to the ground, falling down here. It's also in thermal insulation asbestos rope. The rope is great. Again, it's a great product. Unfortunately, it's so hazardous to human health. Surfacing material, it helps in condensation control, acoustic, fireproofing, and it's also sprayed on or troweled on, as you see in this picture, on popcorn ceiling. This gentleman's wearing just a mere dust mask with this older picture, and there's a good chance that contained asbestos, and it's so fine. These dust masks, in a trade we call them rock catchers, because they just catch rocks. They don't filter the small stuff. They should not really be used, limited use on those, especially around asbestos. Here's some more pictures here. All this material here that we see on this left picture is material that comes loose, that can get easily damaged, and again, is friable. Okay. Asbestos-containing building materials that are miscellaneous. That's floor tiles and ceiling, gaskets. One of the things we do when we go to schools and teach custodians and maintenance people about the floor tile is that it has to have a good coat of wax. And the reason why is, as we'll see in some of these pictures, like on the left here, this is the old typical 9x9 tile. It often contains asbestos, but don't let that fool you. 12x12 tile can also contain asbestos. And In this tile, we teach custodians and maintenance people not to take a dry path in those buffer machines and start grinding up or stripping it off so they get the product airborne. When you look in your school next time, go down the hallway. Look for those small tiles, the 9x9 tiles, and look, they're shiny. They should be. They should be shiny and intact. That's what we do to reduce the children's in tribal schools and in all schools, to reduce the likelihood of getting exposed to asbestos. The picture on the right shows this, it's kind of a cementitious, kind of hard board, and that is, you see there's a picture of it in white, that's asbestos siding. And it can be friable when removed. Intact, again, it's okay. But the problem comes when it's either removed, sawed, and in that question we had about the sealing dots, this picture on the left here, there are little glue spots on the back of these to hold them up against the ceiling. Those glue spots can contain asbestos because it was used, again, for strengthening. On the bottom of some sinks, even metal sinks, the picture on the right shows this little product here, this pad, is used to quiet the sound when the water runs through a sink. Unfortunately, some of them do contain asbestos. Okay, the next slide. When we look for damage to asbestos, we look for holes, rips. Water stains are a big one. As you saw in those pipe asbestos pictures earlier, when water drips, this piping becomes damaged. You need to know that, again, it's microscopic. You won't see it. You won't see the release. When a worker goes into a crawl space, it can be somebody going to check a meter. It could be somebody checking some heating system. These here are actually in a school, these pictures. These are the asbestos TSI wrapping, thermal insulation wrapping, that has fallen. Now, can you imagine a worker crawling through this in his coveralls or her coveralls and then getting all that dust all over them, not knowing they are taking asbestos out of this crawl space and putting it into the lobby of a school? Of course, what they do is when they get all this dust on them, they just dust it off and it goes in the air. We want to educate maintenance people, anybody that will be going into a school, that asbestos is possible to be there. And one of the things we do is we have schools, we teach schools where the asbestos, they get an asbestos inspection by a private inspector. And the locations of that inspection, the locations of that asbestos is then told to anybody that comes into the school that's going to be doing work. This is the top of a boiler. You can see the asbestos is coming apart. This is also TSI because it has a thermal properties about it. Here's some that fell on the floor in a gymnasium above the ceiling. So we have what's called inside the asbestos regulations, we have something called AHERA, A-H-E-R-A. That stands for the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. Schools, all schools, are required to have this plan, if they have asbestos or not. And the idea is when they hire an asbestos professional, they go out there and they look for the locations that asbestos either they know is at or assumed to be at. And the AHERA has the school have a designated person, and it's basically a district representative. It could be a maintenance person or a superintendent, and that person is aware of where the locations are that asbestos might be. It requires training. It says here 14 and a 2-hour, but basically speaking, it requires a 2-hour training for one person in the school to know the locations of the asbestos, and they are our designated person, our go-to person. Now, when work has to be done inside of a school. When asbestos will be disturbed, that's covered by another federal regulation. That's called NESHAP. And NESHAP requires an inspection prior to the renovation or demolition. It requires, in tribal schools, it requires notification to the EPA if it's more than 160 or 260 linear feet. And proper work methods must be adhered to, and proper disposal at a licensed landfill that is willing to accept asbestos containing building materials. That's it in a nutshell. Now, one of the things I want to do, I think this is the most important page, is to make sure that if you have a question, we are only a phone call away. We are just email away. And I'm here for compliance assistance. I'm here to teach you. I'm here to inform you. I'm here to give you information that can help keep the children, employees, staff safe. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll get to your questions in just a moment, but we hope Chris's presentation on asbestos awareness has added to or refreshed your knowledge on the issue. So we're going to ask you again to respond to some polls. And Jeff, I'm not sure I can pronounce your last name, but Gerzika has reminded us that the word blue should be glue. So I'm going to launch the poll, and if you'll read glue instead of blue. The most dangerous of the asbestos-containing building materials listed below is, they should have this one right, Chris. They're going pretty fast here. About half the people have voted. There's a few different opinions. All right, we're going to close the poll in 5 seconds if you haven't voted. Great, so we'll close the poll and share the results. Chris, it looks like that 83% are saying the popcorn ceiling, and there's a few votes for the glue pods, pipe insulation, and the 9x9 floor tiles. We hope you'll correct us with that. Let's go to the second poll, and then we'll hear from Chris. So even when not disturbed, asbestos is dangerous and can cause asbestosis. So if you'll vote, 66% have voted. A few more seconds, we'll leave it open. This vote came through real quickly. We'll close the poll, share the results. So Chris, 94% of the participants say that that is false. So would you like to say anything about the polls, Chris?
Sure. Thank you, Carolina. One of the things I wanted to say is that gymnasium. We all see kids in a gymnasium and throwing balls around, and that's where we talk about the popcorn ceiling. Children throw the balls on the ceiling just to see if they can get them up there and watch the stuff fall. So that's where that comes from. When asbestos is intact and not being disturbed, it is not hazardous.
All right, so it might have just been the way the question was stated. Anything else you have to say, Chris, about the division of the scores?
I guess the one of the things that I wanted to talk about on the last on the questions for clarification, and I'm looking through my paper here. I don't know if anybody was able to hear the video, but I know that I've listened to people breathe that have asbestosis, and I can't emphasize enough. It takes 20 years, 15 years to take effect, a latency period. The more one is exposed to asbestos, the higher it's a dose-related disease. So workers, they're in probably the most susceptible because of the exposure.
Okay. Well, we'll go to the we'll go to the end of the program and see if we can get some questions. All right, so you remember that you have two ways to participate with questions. One is to send a question through the question box, and I got some good feedback on the sound. I'm so sorry about that, and thanks particularly for some of our other presenters and our project manager for giving us advice here. Thank you. Let's see, there was a question. Jeff, I don't know if you're still on the line. Let me see if I can unmute you. Would you like to ask your question out loud? Can't find you. There you are. Okay. Jeff, I've unmuted you. Would you like to ask your question out loud? All right, so I'm going to ask it for him. Chris, here's the question. I have a question for the EPA rep. If during the course of performing the 6-month surveillance in a school, there were numerous areas where there was noted damage to some pipe insulation, say one small puncture or tear in each of 12 rooms, can you elaborate on the gray line between the repairing this under the O&M program, and when would you consider this to be a response action requiring a project design and clearance set testing?
Okay, thank you. Good question. One of the things that AHERA allows is it's the 2-hour training that is required when you work around asbestos and do not disturb it. But if you're going to disturb it, 14 additional hours, sometimes referred to as the 16-hour course, is required. Each state can have its own regulation as to the amount of asbestos that you can disturb, because minor repairs, short-term duration, is allowed. And if you would be kind to email me about your state, I can either find out or get you in touch with your state representative. And yes, it would be required that for just everybody listening, that it would be required that when repairs are done, it would be included inside your operation and maintenance, and it needs to be recorded, and it has to be repaired. In most cases, repaired, but sometimes removal is required, and that is determined at the time on the severity of the damage.
All right. Are there any other questions? We can take questions in two ways. You can type it into the question box, or you can also just click on the hand and we can unmute your line.
Carolina, that video has a great impact. I would encourage anybody to go on YouTube and just put in BC Workplace Video Asbestos, and it's a great video. Turn your sound on and enjoy it.
Yeah, it is a good video. It's rather frightening, actually. All right, we're going to wait a second to see if there are any other questions. I'm watching the question box. All right, so people are telling me they don't have questions. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for attending the Asbestos Awareness webinar. After this brief announcement, Chris will present a program on lead-based paint, renovation, repair, and painting rule. There's no videos in that, so don't worry about that possibility of a problem. And following that presentation, Chris and I will remain on the broadcast for an additional few minutes to be sure that we've answered all your questions about asbestos and about lead-based paint, the RRP rule. Our Clean, Green, and Healthy Tribal Schools initiative will be sponsoring a 2-day workshop in June or July this year. The workshop will include some of the programs featured in our series and additional topics. Participants will have the opportunities for discussion and collaboration with presenters and co-participants in person. Please let us know if you might be interested in attending.